Welcome into the Big City Sports Podcast. We have another episode coming up, and today we're getting into the National Football League. I know you missed it. It's been a while since we talked about it, but today, like I said, all NFL and all our teams. That's the Giants, Jets, and Bears, and we're going to go in the order of Bears, Giants, Jets today. But before we get into any of that, Slig, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I feel refreshed from my little mini vacation last week. Got to see the Yankees win. Thank God for that. I flew all the way out there. Saw the 12th of what ended up being a 13-game winning streak. So that was cool. Got out of my normal routine for a few days. Had a wedding over the weekend. So it's mostly been fun for the last few days, but definitely looking forward to getting some NFL talk in. It's been a while, and the season's coming up.
Yeah, that explains why you trimmed your hedges on your face there for the wedding, obviously. So good luck for you. But we're going to get right into the NFL talk. Glad you were able to experience a Yankees W in person, especially that far away. You don't want to go that far to get shellacked. So let's get into the Chicago Bears. And the Bears this season, the whole hype is around Justin Fields. Everyone wants to see the rookie take the field. Everyone wants to see if he is the next guy. And he's flashed a little bit in the preseason. Let's start right at that quarterback position, and they decided to go to Andy Dalton. Do you think that's the right move?
No, I don't. But as a Giants fan, I'm going to say this a lot. I say it to my friends who are Bears fans every time I see them. I will say it on this podcast a lot, just as a warning. Since the Giants have the Bears' first-round pick next season as a result of the Bears trading up for Fields, I hope the Bears go 0-17 this year. I don't expect that to happen, but I'm going to be actively rooting against them every single week. So yeah, just as a heads up for everyone listening. So from a Giants fan perspective, I hope Dalton starts the entire season because I don't think the Bears will be as good if he does, and they will lose more games. But from the Bears side of things, no, I don't think it's the right move. I know that Justin Fields is going to have an adjustment period, an acclimation process, but I don't think it's unheard of it's not unheard of for rookie quarterbacks to come in, especially in the first round, and start right away, even have some initial success. Now, you can point to examples of rookie QBs who have been good, who have been rushed in their development. But let's just look at the other quarterbacks drafted in the first round this year. We knew going in that Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson would be starting for the Jaguars and the Jets with the first two picks. And then we also knew that barring some sort of unforeseen change, that Trey Lance would have to wait at least a little bit before he started for San Francisco. They're in a bit more of a unique spot. And then there was the real shocker, I'd say, of the last couple of days, where the Patriots cut Cam Newton and Mac Jones is going to be starting from year one. And I don't think any of us really saw that one coming when that pick was made. But we know what Andy Dalton is at this point in his career. Now, I'm not trying to take anything away from him in terms of he's had a solid career considering he was a second-round pick of the Bengals. In terms of talent, though, productivity, there's no real sense to me in starting him. It's just you're only delaying the inevitable there. You're going to make it more difficult for yourself to get off to a decent start this season. And the Bears, I know for the second, third year in a row, they're in a kind of a weird spot. Maybe they're thinking they're playing the Rams week one, who have that incredibly dangerous defensive front. That would be one hell of a defense to introduce Justin Fields to the NFL to. So maybe they're just going to let Dalton take his licks there first. But I personally see this as similar to the Browns situation a couple years ago when they had Tyrod Taylor entrenched and they drafted Baker Mayfield. I know he was first overall, but they said Taylor was going to be the starter. He lasted until about halfway through week 3. And I personally think this is going to be a very similar spot.
That's a great comparison. That is a great comparison looking at it from that angle. But when I see this, I see Matt Nagy with delusional glasses on, thinking that this is the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, you bring in a few years ago as Cordero Patterson. That doesn't work out. You bring in Marquise Goodwin this year, trying to find who that Tyreek Hill is going to be on this offense. And you draft David Montgomery. You get some sort of back to where it could help you out a little bit. And then you get your quarterback. And you're like, all right, since it worked in Kansas City, let's pretend like Justin Fields is Patrick Mahomes and let's sit him behind Alex Smith. Well, the only difference is the Bears aren't making the playoffs with Andy Dalton. And I don't like the narrative that you mentioned about not sticking him out there to take his licks against the Rams. Because, I mean, you're still playing tough teams in that division. I mean, you're going to face a Vikings front that is getting a lot of players back. You're going to be facing a Packers team that's at least average, if not good, at rushing the passer. So there's a lot that you're going to see there. But looking at it from the Bears' success standpoint, you really need the quarterback that could get out of the pocket, because that offensive line is horrible. I mean, it's bad. And you stick Justin Fields back there, you're going to be rolling around. That's your only hope of extending plays and pushing the ball down the field. Dalton's a statue. You saw him behind a horrible offensive line in Dallas last year. He got his ass kicked. And that's a spot right now where I don't think any Bears fan could be any bit excited about Andy Dalton starting.
You see, Dalton in Dallas was kind of an interesting situation, because I still think Dalton is one of the best backup quarterbacks in the league. I thought he was a really good backup for the Cowboys, but the Cowboys have had a vaunted offensive line for at least a decade now, and all of them except for Connor Williams got hurt at one point last season. So the protection that's normally there for Prescott or for whoever the quarterback is was not there for Andy Dalton, and that nullified the advantage that the Cowboys had with all their skill position players. Now you put him here in Chicago, and the offensive line is not great, to say the least. And the skill position players, well, it's a slightly better group than last year, I would say, is still, I'd say, league average at best. So I agree that you're going to need somebody who can extend plays, make things happen out of the pocket. We talked about that last year. Mitch Trubisky, as flawed as he is, at least had the athleticism to do that. Nick Foles did not, and still doesn't. And Andy Dalton is not really a mobile guy either. Now, I'm not disagreeing that the Rams are the only tough test that Fields or any quarterback would face. That's not what I was going for. But if you look at, so Baker Mayfield, when he first came in, that was a game against the Jets. It
Right.
eased him in a little bit, a chance where they had a game where they had a chance to win. They did end up winning that game. The Dolphins, when they first put in Tagovailoa, they put him in against a flawed defense rather than somebody who's going to make his life hell from the first snap that he takes. So I think, I don't think that the Bears are going to say, we're not going to play Fields against any good defense. I think they just want to get him. My guess is that they would like to get him in against a defense up front that is not as scary as the Rams, just for his first game, get him a little bit of confidence and rhythm right off the bat, and then obviously escalate from there, because you can't really control who's on your schedule. That's where my mind is at. So if Dalton starts more than a couple of games, I will be really surprised. I do think Fields, I liked him more than Zach Wilson going into this draft, for whatever that's worth. He was my QB2, and I do really see the talent. We saw flashes of it in the preseason, and I still think that game reps are the best way to get him ready for the NFL.
With a rookie quarterback, and I know that it doesn't seem this way with the way we're talking about it. I agree with the decision to go with Andy Dalton. That's what I agree with here. I don't necessarily think, I don't agree at all with the decision to play Dalton the entire year. That's just stupid. That's mind-boggling. It's messed up. So you look at it and you see a rookie quarterback. The way you do it in the NFL is when you buy a glove, you buy a baseball glove and you go out to a Dick's Sporting Goods or whatever. You don't just go and play a game with it, right? You put some cream in it. You set it under a thing undernight. You break it in so it's ready to go out and ready for use. And that's the way you do it with a quarterback. You make sure that they see the game week to week preparation. Training camp's a different ball game. But when you go week after week in the NFL, you watch what happens. Then after about 3-4 weeks, whatever it is, that's when you stick him out there, knowing that he's had the reps in camp, knowing what needs to take place during a week. And that's what happened with Justin Fields. And I think that's the route the Bears are going to take.
Okay, that started to make more sense as you went along, because you started that with in the NFL, you go buy a baseball glove. And I was a little bit confused as to where you were going with that. I think the Bears are only deluding themselves by thinking that they can really start Dalton really at all. I mean, considering the everything we've seen in the season with the reactions from the fan base and everything, I do think Justin Fields is the jolt of energy that the Bears fan base was looking for. But I do really like the leadership and the intelligence. We all know that Dalton and Nick Foles, who's somehow still on the roster, are at the very least good sounding boards, good veteran voices, experienced players that Fields can learn some things from in terms of reading defenses, route progressions, whatever whatever, name it. They've been around long enough to know it. But in terms of talent, it's clear who the guy is and who the guy is going to be sooner rather than later. I do like what we've seen already from Fields from leadership standpoint in terms of the preseason game where Dalton was getting booed. Bears got destroyed pretty good in the preseason game against Buffalo, I think it was. And you hear the boos for him, the chance for Jim. When he was asked about it, he said, yeah, I heard it, but show support for all of us, essentially. Show support for both quarterbacks. Like you see, you like that attitude and the humility. Obviously, I'm sure he knows deep down that he is going to be the guy here sooner rather than later. But a guy that's in a pretty tough media market, not ruffling feathers in his first preseason, is probably a decent way to start off. And I'd like to think that the Bears have learned something from their, let's say, flawed developmental process of Mitch Trubisky, which is the last quarterback that was in this situation. Justin Fields, frankly, Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace and the Bears as a whole cannot afford for that same history to repeat itself. I don't think it will. They're very different players, but that's the most recent comparison for a quarterback that the Bears traded up for and would hope would be the quarterback of the future.
You know who didn't hear any boos in Chicago? That's Javi Baez, but that's a topic for another day. Let's get into the Bears as a whole. I say this because next week I do want to tease what's coming up. We're going to get into every single NFL team, and it's going to be another longer episode. It won't be too incredibly long, but it's still going to be enough packed to where we dive into the divisions, playoff teams, all that good stuff as we lead up to the start of the NFL season. But right here, we're going to get into the Bears as a whole. I know we talked about the quarterback situation, our thought process on that. Where do you see this Bears team? Let's start with the defense. What do you think their defense could bring this season?
The defense is going to have a lot of pressure on it for the upteenth year in a row. And I know that it's a possible standard to hold them to for that 2018 defensive team that was arguably the best in football, absolutely led into the 12-4 record in the playoff appearance, and led to some false hope among Trubisky and the rest of the offense, right? Most of the core players from the 2018 defense are still there. But while the 3 years old, 3 years more age that these players have now might be good for a guy like Roquan Smith, who was still young at the time, it's not as good for the Danny Trevathans or Robert Quinn's. Well, I know he wasn't there, but he is now. It wasn't good for the Danny Trevathans, might not be as good for Akeem Hicks. You could even make the argument for a Khalil Mack. They're like that. You might make the argument late 20s, early 30s, not quite as impactful as they were 3 years ago, right? And you look at the Bears defense now, while there's definitely some talent, I don't expect it to be a bad defense by any means. I have some major question marks, especially at the cornerback position, where the Bears have basically let any experience walk out the window. They do not have Kyle Fuller anymore. They cut Desmond Trufant a couple of days ago when they trimmed their roster down. I thought Jalen Johnson had a promising rookie season as the starter out of Utah, and I do expect him to be a solid corner here as the clear CB1. But there's not an experienced option right now that will start across. Like I think Kindle Vildor, who was, I think, around 5 pick, I do like him. And I do think like he is capable of being a serviceable starter, but thrusting him into the CB2 role right away here is a very, very risky move. And the fact that the Bears are relatively thin at the cornerback spot is only going to put more pressure on the pass rush to get to the quarterback, because if they don't, the secondary is eventually going to get picked apart.
I like your comparison there or not necessarily comparison, but the thought process in the cornerback spot. I personally think they were one of the teams that should have called the Jaguars about Sidney Jones before they dealt him to New Orleans, was it? I can't remember where they traded. Seattle, right. He ended up in Seattle. I think that's a spot where the Bears should have looked, take a gander at adding to that cornerback room, because outside of that, I'm looking at the depth chart right now. They got Xavier Crawford, who has been around the block a little bit. And then outside of that, it's Duke Shelley. That's it for the corners. So I don't like it at all. I think they should probably upgrade that position. I mean, we could still see it right now. There were some roster cuts. You could still add people. You could still make a trade in between now and then. We saw the Bears make a big splash for Khalil Mack right before week 1. I don't think something that big is going to happen. But I think this defense, you mentioned getting older. That's a fact. They're not going to be as good as they once were. Tashawn Gibson's another name that's getting older, but I think they can be serviceable, and they're going to be a good enough defense to where they're still top 15. They're still going to make plays. They have Roquan Smith in the middle, and they're going to be in good shape from a defensive side.
Well, I think the main acquisition the Bears have made on the defensive side is their new defensive coordinator, which is Sean Desai. They do not have Chuck Pagano anymore, which I'm sure most Bears fans are thrilled to hear. I know Colts fans were thrilled to hear it before that, so there's a bit of a precedent here. But defensively, you look at the personnel. So the players who most recently played, I'd say, at that elite level. We know what Khalil Mack is capable of. He wasn't quite as elite last season. Not trying to take anything away, but there's a lot of pressure on him considering how talented he is. So how at his best nobody else can do what he can do, at least on the Bears defense. And then I had also look at Eddie Jackson from the safety spot, who has been a little bit up and down. Still a hit overall considering he was drafted in the later rounds, but somebody who has been fluctuating in terms of their productivity the last couple of years. There's pressure on those guys. Can they rebound in Sean Desai's system? And then I think one underrated aspect of defense is still the interior defensive line. Hakeem Hicks, who's had a bit of a bizarre offseason, is still with the Bears and a damn good underrated football player. And Eddie Goldman, who opted out last season, is going to be there to help collapse the pocket from the interior as well. And they're going to need those two to do that because that'll help Khalil Mack, who they might be able to get more one-on-one situations where he can still dominate. And even more intriguingly, maybe that can unlock something from Robert Quinn, who in his first year with the Bears was a complete bust.
Yeah. He had zero production. I mean, you didn't know if he was out there or not. I mean, simply put, you didn't know if he was on the damn football field every time you looked up. I mean, his sack totals weren't there, I should say. And it wasn't good. It wasn't a good season. I do think he'll bounce back. I mean, it's not going to happen every year. He's warranted that contract. I know you didn't like it at the time because it sort of was a move that Leonard Floyd sort of similar spot. You gave the money to a person that's similar, but I think that he can have a better season this year. But with that, let's just switch over to the offensive side. Let's look at their offense. I do know Allen Robinson, a big guy. He's going to be back. I've been teasing it for years now on the show. Allen Robinson's not going to be a Bear. Well, he continues to wow us because the day after Dalton signed with the Bears, before Justin Fields was even a thought, Allen Robinson signed that franchise tag. He's the main guy on the outside. Darnell Mooney, who you loved before the season started last year. I'll point that out. You were on the Mooney hype train before the season started. He had a great year last year, probably more leaps here this season. I'm excited for this Bears offense.
Okay, so I will get into the offense in a second. Really quick, I want to go back to the Quinn thing for a second because we got to make sure everyone knows. He only had 2 sacks last year, and he was paid $60 million on that contract. Can't quite get over that without mentioning it. Now, he could be better, but that's a pretty low bar considering what was invested into him. And one other note, we'll get into it, I'm sure, as the season goes along. You know who the Bears have at linebacker right now, made the 53-man?
Who's that?
Ogletree.
Alec Ogletree made the roster?
He sure did. So he's been with the Giants. He spent last season with the Jets, and he somehow managed to make the Bears roster. So
he's a big city sports specialist. We got to get him on the show.
I mean, that would be a pretty cool. That would be a pretty cool plug right there. I'll have to send this to him. But yeah, he's been around all 3 of these teams now. But I just wanted to throw that out. Focusing on the offense, we already hit the quarterback situation. So I want to start with the offensive line. We did agree. I think the Bears' 2nd round pick, Tevin Jenkins, the offensive tackle out of Oklahoma State. I like that pick a lot. I do think he will be a very solid NFL tackle. But he has gotten injured here in the offseason, which led to the Bears signing Jason Peters, the longtime Eagle, who's had a fantastic career, but is 39 years old and has been banged up the last couple of seasons. And we also have seen Hermaine Ifedi, who's at least been good for what the Bears invested into him, I guess. Average offensive lineman at best. He's also been banged up. So a big question mark is going to start the season at least a little bit less than full strength.
Yeah, that's a good point on Tevin Jenkins. That's probably the main outlier there heading in because he had some injury issues. They weren't sure. Obviously, they invested a high pick in him in the 2nd round, And a lot of Bears fans like him. I like him. I think he's going to have a good career, but he's banged up right now, going to start the season on the list. I do know that Jason Peters when he got the Bears phone call, he was out fishing. So his 39-year-old ass was out there catching bass, and he was got the phone call, and he's like, you know what? I'll play football for the Chicago Bears. So good on him. But well, let's look at the tight end position as well. They have tons of tight ends there. Jimmy Graham, your boy, one of your favorite signings, of course, from last offseason. And Cole Kmet. Cole Kmet, I think, takes a big leap this season on the Bears offense.
Yeah, I do think Komet will be a better player. I didn't hate him as a player. I thought the second round was a little rich for him when he was drafted, but he was also the best of a pretty weak tight end class in the 2020 draft. So I think he was kind of the beneficiary there, not taking anything away from him. I do think he will improve in year two. I thought he was a solid rookie season. I thought Graham having the walk-off touchdown in the Saints game was pretty funny. I thought that would have been if he decided to retire, I think that would have been a pretty good way to go out. Catch a touchdown on your last play, walk off into the locker room. I know it was a loss, but I still thought that was interesting. I think he's at the very least the experience, the pedigree will provide a little bit of experience to Komet, some leadership. It's the wide receiver position that intrigues me a bit with the Bears this year. Now we know what Robinson is. I still would be surprised if he re-signs with the Bears past this season, but once he was given the tag, I'm not shocked, I guess, that he decided to sign the 1-year tender. I thought maybe he was thinking he'd get traded like Jarvis Landry did, but that didn't end up coming to fruition. I do think it's highly unlikely the Bears tag him again. So he should have the freedom to do whatever he wants after this upcoming season. Darnell Mooney, thank you for that shout out. Every once in a while, these guys make me look smart. And I was happy to see his speed made an instant impact. The Bears do not have Anthony Miller anymore. They traded him to the Texans, and they brought in Damiere Byrd, who had a decent season for the Patriots last year, and Marquise Goodwin, who's got a lot of speed and should be a really good guy for Mooney to learn from in particular. Opted out last year. I think he's going to be someone that will be a factor in this offense. He adds a little bit more of a dynamic to it.
Yeah, and hopefully he's not someone that Matt Nagy will hand the ball to on 3rd and 1 and stick him in the backfield like they did with the wide receiver who was fast, named Cordero Patterson. But obviously that's not going to happen. But I look at the Bears, and I want to get into the running back room before we get into the Giants. This one sort of intrigues me. You know, the injury to Tariq Cohen, he's not back. Matt Nagy was asked a press conference question today if he had to have 2 surgeries for Tariq Cohen, and he was not answering. So you could read between the lines there on what happened. But it's Damian Williams who's really going to have some sort of a pass catching role. I know I might be in the wrong here, but I think Damian Williams has a bigger role on this offense than a lot of people think.
I think he could have a role, but I think David Montgomery is actually in a better space right now than he was last year at this time, because he did finish last season pretty strong. I've heard good things about him in camp, so I do expect him to be the clear lead back here. And I also like the pick the Bears made later in the round in the draft this year with Khalil Herbert out of Virginia Tech. I do expect him to get integrated a little bit more as the season goes along. He is somebody I think who can fill some short yardage roles, goal line situations potentially. But the question, of course, is how much are they going to be able to run behind the Bears offensive line? There's Jason Peters, a possible Hall of Famer, but is he the same player he once was? I would argue no, nothing, no insult intended there. We'll see how Tevin Jenkins does whenever he comes back. You look at the rest of the line. Ifedi's a bit of a question mark. Bobby Massey's gone. Charles Leno's is gone. It's more the interior that's also had some injuries. Like if Sam Mustipher, I think, has become the clear leader of that group, and Cody Whitehair and James Daniels are at least capable of being solid players when they're healthy, but keeping them on the field has been the biggest issue, right? And the Bears offensive line depth, not like there's too much going around on trees in that in the NFL, is pretty subpar. And unfortunately for them, they're probably going to have some reserves starting several games in the NFL for them, which is not going to make their life easier for the quarterback or definitely their running backs as well. I don't think Cohen, whenever he does come back, will be able to change too much. I know that he can be used creatively. He's going to be out at least the first 6 weeks on the PUP list. But considering Damian Williams' ability as a receiver, I don't think it's going to be a hugely noticeable issue. I think the pass protection is going to be more noticeable from the start, regardless.
That's fair. That's a good point. Um, I do question here. Now you bring up the offensive line. Sam Mustipher and Alex Bars. They tried their best to keep in that Bears offensive line together last year. Obviously, they were buried on the depth chart before the season started. They both got some action. They both played, and they tried their best to keep it afloat. And I think they're solid players, but they're not every single game starters in the NFL. Maybe Mustipher is. I don't think Bars is by any stretch of the imagination. But right now in the depth chart, it's Sam Mustipher over a Cody Whitehair at the center position. I think that's the right call.
Yeah, and I do think Mustipher's exceeded expectations a bit and has become one of the clear leaders of the Bears offensive line. But even if he does stay healthy the whole season, sustain the ability we've seen more recently from him, one good offensive lineman does not solve the entire offensive line as a whole, not even close. So it would be a step in the right direction. I do think Tevin Jenkins will be a very solid NFL tackle, but we don't know exactly when he's going to play for the Bears this year and how much of an acclimation process it will be for him when he does, because we also have to remember he was the right tackle at Oklahoma State. If they do start him on the left side, not saying he can't make the adjustment, but it will take time. You do everything backwards in terms of hands, footwork, everything. And we've seen all pros. It does take an adjustment period. Now, guys like Andrew Whitworth started on the opposite side in college, became a great NFL left tackle. There's definitely a precedent, but we can't expect him to be Orlando Pace in week one either.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's fair. And what the most recent example of that is Orlando Brown going from right tackle to left tackle when Ronnie Stanley got injured. And he did a great job at that. But that's going to wrap it up for the Bears talk. But before we get into the Giants, are you ready to make a record prediction for the Bears?
Yeah, a lot of that is going to be predicated on what they do at the quarterback spot. I think they have a pretty tough schedule, and there's definitely some flaws on the team. Right now, I'm going to go either 6-11 or 7-10.
I'm sitting at 6-11. That was my thought process right now. I just think there's so much like their defense could probably steal them a game or two. But is this offense, when Fields comes in, are they going to be struggling to score 20 points like they usually do every year? That's going to be the question for me, is if Fields can be dynamic right away, then they're going to win more games than we expect, but we really do not know. So based off of that, that's why I have them at 6-11.
I think that's fair. I think Fields' natural passing ability will show up right from the start. We know what kind of arm he has, what kind of accuracy and placement he has. I think it's going to be more the mental processing side that's going to take him a little bit longer to adjust to in terms of coverages, blitzes, etc., making the right reads, going through the whole field, things like that. It will take time. He absolutely has the ability to improve on it. I do think he will eventually become a very solid NFL quarterback. But I think we're going to see more flashes from him whenever he starts. We might see him go down and even win a game or two, but we're also going to see the limitations of him and the Bears offense in his rookie season.
Yeah, I think we'll see the same. But let's get into the Giants. And the Giants are a team this year where they were so close to the playoffs last year. Granted, it was a tough division and things were a little awry, but that defense really, really stepped up for them last year. And they made plays. I know we talked about it during the season about the cornerback depth. The secondary played well. And I'm excited to see what McKinney can bring here in his first full season. He got a little bit of action late last year. Obviously, a high draft pick there, second round in 2020. I love this defense. They made the draft choice of Azeez Ojulari, who had a first round grade for some people, and they got him in the second. So they drafted well. I think the defense is in a good spot. Let's start on the defensive side of the ball. What do you think?
I definitely feel better about the Giants defensively than I do offensively. I don't think that's exactly a unique take. But I just, as an instinct here, I have a very bad feeling about this season. Though I've talked to some other people about this off the pod. Like on paper, you see the Giants make these big splashy moves in free agency, and you see what some of the things they did in the draft, and they look intelligent enough to an extent, but I don't feel good about this. I had the same feeling before the 2017 season when the Giants were coming off of a playoff appearance and people thought we might be NFC contenders. I thought it was going to be a disaster, and it ended up being even worse than I thought, because that was the whole McAdoo, Eli, Geno Smith bullshit. I don't miss that. Now, I don't think it's going to get quite that chaotic, but I don't feel good about it. So we'll start with the part of the Giants I feel better about. Defense, fine. If everyone's healthy, the Giants should have one of the best secondaries in the NFL. Adoree Jackson, the corner signed from the Titans, is a huge pickup to the scheme of this defense. Patrick Graham, who did a fantastic job in his first year with the Giants, prefers to run more man defensive coverage schemes. And because the cornerback 2 spot across from James Bradbury was such a weak spot, like we discussed last year, he was forced to adapt and play more zone. And he did a good job, but the Giants have clearly addressed the cornerback spot. If Bradbury and Jackson are healthy, they're going to run a lot of man coverage. They also have Darnay Holmes back, who had a solid rookie year in the slot. They drafted Aaron Robinson in the 3rd round as well, and he's going to miss the beginning of the year because he's injured. But the Giants also drafted Rodarius Williams, Greedy's older brother, in the 6th round, and I'm surprised he fell that far, and he had a strong camp, and I expect him to have a role. They still have Sam Beal who somehow made the roster again. They traded for Josh Jackson, who's been a bust for the Packers. There's a lot of bodies just at the cornerback spot. And that's not even getting into the 3 safeties who are going to play a lot. And that's Logan Ryan, Xavier McKinney, and Jabril Peppers. So there's a good amount of depth in that secondary. I didn't even mention Julian Love yet. So I do expect that to be a pretty deep, pretty effective group. The Giants are kind of going that pass coverage over pass rush approach, but I think the pass rush could be at least a little bit better. I do have questions, though. I don't think Leonard Williams is likely to replicate the career year he had last season. I think he could still be a very good player, but the odds of him getting double-digit sacks again, I'd say, are pretty minimal. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no shot.
So if he gets more somewhere in the 5 to 7 sack range, which I think is more reasonable for him, that production would have to be replaced somewhere else. Now, I'm curious to see what kind of role Azeez Ojulari has. I think trading down, getting him at 50 was a pretty good value. I'm curious to see if this is the year Lorenzo Carter finally stays healthy, another athletic Georgia pass rusher. We've seen flashes, and if he can stay on the field, I think they could at least be a decent combination of edge rushers. We'll see if O'Shane Jimenez has any sort of role. The Giants also drafted Ellerson Smith in the 4th round this year, and I did like that pick, but he's also going to start the year on an injured reserve, so we won't see him for at least a month. There are options, I guess. I don't think the pass rush will be quite as limited as it was last year, but it's not going to be confused for the Rams front 4 either. My biggest questions on defense would be coming from the linebacker spots outside of Blake Martinez. But if the Giants defense is mostly healthy, there is a legitimate possibility this is a top 5 to 10 defense in the NFL, especially I'd say top 5 secondary. But the objective is still putting points on the board. You can't rely on your defense to do that. And if the Giants offense remains ineffective and the Giants defense is on the field 43 minutes a game, they will eventually get worn down.
Yeah, that's where I was going. The defense, I agree with that statement of top 5. Even if there's some tested there, even if the secondary gets banged up a little bit, you alluded to their depth. I mean, it's scary how deep they are in the secondary. I was excited for my Jaguars. For those that don't know, I'm a Jaguars fan. I know the secondary depth we had at the cornerback position with Shaquille Griffin. We had Sidney Jones before we traded him, Trey Herndon, CJ Henderson. We drafted a kid out of Georgia. I mean, there were a lot, Tyson Campbell. So there's a ton of cornerbacks on both of our teams that we like a lot. But I think the Giants are set up because they have these veteran players. Adoree Jackson's a phenomenal ad. He is one of the best players I've seen in the AFC South for a while. He's fast. He's great on the outside. He's going to have an impact on this defense right away. And I think they're built. Patrick Graham is such a great defensive coordinator. We saw it last year where he incorporated players coming in and out of that defense. And he really put them in position to succeed. And he got the most out of his players. And I think that's what you want out of a defensive coordinator. I think we're going to see the same again here in year 2 with him.
I'd like to see that. I do think the Giants' defense is it was one of the league's better defenses, at least in the top half last year. It could take another step forward because most of the important personnel is back. There were additions made to the secondary. Xavier McKinney didn't really play much his rookie year. He missed most of the year with a foot injury. He's coming into camp healthy. He finished strong last year. I am excited to see. He should be lined up all over the field. He can line him up in the slot, linebacker, corner, safety. So I am really excited to see him. In the defensive front, outside of Leonard Williams, we already mentioned. The main loss that we haven't mentioned yet is Dalvin Tomlinson, who's been a very solid, underrated player for the Giants ever since he was drafted. He signed with the Vikings. The Giants replaced him by bringing in Danny Shelton for a year, who I think is fine as a stopgap. He's at the very least a big body who should be able to stop the run a little bit. And outside of that, the Giants brought Austin Johnson back, who was solid in limited snaps last year. Raymond Johnson III made the roster as an undrafted free agent. He's kind of the feel-good story of the Giants preseason. And outside of that, they did, speaking of guys who played well in limited role, that would be BJ Hill, who I've always said was an underrated player. And BJ Hill was actually traded to the Bengals for an offensive lineman. We'll get into that shortly, I'm sure. But the depth of the group is a little bit thinner this year. The Giants are banking on that pair of Johnsons to be productive. And I don't think that's completely misguided. But if Danny Shelton were to get injured or be ineffective, there would be a lot of pressure on those two because there's not really much depth on the interior behind them. And I know that's weird to talk about with the defensive tackle, that position that Dave Gettleman loves so much.
Yeah, he loves them. That's your go-to phrase on the show, WAPs to the defensive tackles. But yeah.
I don't know how I did this, but I need to slap myself. How did I not mention Dexter Lawrence during any of that?
Yeah, Dexter Lawrence was unmentioned. You name dropped the feel good story of Johnson. You brought up Elerson Smith, but you haven't brought up Dexter Lawrence.
It's been a long day. Dexter Lawrence is going to be playing either the middle or the 3-4 defensive end role in this defense, and he can absolutely be a disruptive player. He's very underrated. I definitely think he can step in and do a lot of, if not more than what Dalvin Tomlinson could. I know that they usually line up in different spots, but Dexter Lawrence is a very, very good, not the flashiest player, but a very effective one who can be effective against the run and the pass. And if him and Leonard Williams are both healthy, I expect them to definitely create a little bit of I expect them to be able to collapse pockets from the interior. That will hopefully allow Ojulari, Lorenzo Carter, whoever, to have a little bit more success from the outside. Because if they're able to do that, the secondary, I feel like, should be able to hold up pretty well for the most part. And the Giants' limitations at linebacker might be minimized a bit. They still have Martinez, exceeded my expectations in year one. The other inside linebacker is probably going to be Reggie Ragland this year. It's an upgrade over Devontae Downs, but I wouldn't call it anything special either.
Yeah. I have a comparison here for Dexter Lawrence. Call me out of line. Call me a great comp here. Before we get into the offense, I think Dexter Lawrence reminds me a lot of Stephon Tuitt.
Ooh, okay. I can see that with the versatility where they were lined up and everything. It's the monster size. Like, I see some of the versatility and pass rush ability of Tuitt, and then I see the run stuffing ability of a Sean Rogers, who was just a freak in several different ways with his years at the Lions. He actually briefly played for the Giants at the end of his career, but he was always somebody I remembered. And I kind of get a similar vibe, like a combination of those two a little bit. But Lawrence is, I think could have been drafted a little bit later. Considering the Giants' other first-round picks in recent years, Lawrence looks like a genius compared to the rest of them.
He does. And one of those first-round picks was this year, Kadarius Toney, who you were not very fond of on draft night. I remember your Twitter comments. I remember the text messages I received. And you were not fond of him. So let's start right at the wide receiver room. They brought in Kenny Golladay. He's a big-name player. You have Sterling Shepard. You have Darius Slayton, obviously, there. John Ross made the roster. CJ Board's on the roster. Dante Pettis, and then Kadarius Toney. Pettis was just waived.
Yeah, and they claim Colin Johnson from Jacksonville. We talked about that a bit ago. Okay. We'll get into the wide receiver position. Do you know why I think this Giants season is going to be a disaster on par with the Hindenburg?
I'm going to guess because every single wide receiver that I named is injury prone.
Well, that's to me the least of the problems. I do think it's an issue, but yeah, there are three main issues. The closer we get, I don't see the Giants getting over them. And we'll talk about the most important one first. It's just a gut feeling here. I don't feel good about Daniel Jones. I just don't.
Yep.
Now, especially in this offense. Now, I am not going to sit here and lie to you guys and say that I was a big fan of Pat Shurmur as a coach before Joe Judge was brought in. But Pat Shurmur's offensive system was a much better fit for Daniel Jones, which is why we saw him flourish a lot more in his rookie season than he did last year. Now, there were offensive line issues both years. There were skill position issues both years. So I think the offense is the biggest indicator there. Jason Garrett was able to limit the fumbles a little bit, but there are absolutely there's no creativity. He's one of the other problems. Let me ask it this way. Let's say Jones has healthy weapons this year and a healthy Saquon Barkley. We'll get into him, and an offensive line that performs average in the league, maybe the 20th best, because I don't see them doing any better. What do you really think Daniel Jones' ceiling is? I don't think he's going to be the guy that you're going to win games because of. At best, you'll win games with him because of a decent amount of talent around him. I think Jones, like the mobility is legitimate. I do think he has pretty good touch on the deep ball. He does pretty well in the vertical game, but the tunnel vision, the turnovers, obviously, I don't see those being correctable problems enough for him to be an upper tier quarterback in the NFL.
Yeah, I'm not a big Daniel Jones guy at all. I personally think he's the worst starting quarterback in the National Football League this season. That might be a hot take. I think he is the worst starting quarterback in the NFL right now. I was looking at destinations for Cam Newton the other day, and the only place I could think of where I think he could start over someone is New York. But besides the point, I want to get into Jason Garrett. And you mentioned there's nothing to his offense. I'm going to I'm going to movie drop a quote here on you, see if you know it. Jason Garrett's offense is like cow. Cow is a soft white rice in lukewarm water. It has no taste, benefited in small bites, and is usually fed for old people or infants.
Thank you for the quote from The Hangover 2 there.
Nice. That's what it is.
Yeah, no, I know it. The great movie. Anyway. Yeah, Jason Garrett's the second problem I wanted to get into with the offense. I can't with him. I examined him as much as possible last year. I hated the hiring from the start. I'm not going to hide that. I don't like it anymore now, but there were at least a couple of attributes. Jason Garrett did usually have a pretty good script for his first drive. The Giants did go down and have decent first halves a couple of times, but then nothing after that. And I talk so much about I want them to have more vertical concepts in their offense. Now, that does not necessarily mean throw the ball deep every play, because that wouldn't work either. Jones does throw a pretty good deep ball. He does have some things to work with, but what I mean by that more is, let's say on a crossing route, a deep dig, whatever, you give the receiver or whoever catches the ball an ability to make something happen after the catch. Jason Garrett does not do that for the most part. He mostly says, run to the sticks and turn around, which I have a huge problem with. If every single 3rd and 5, 3rd and 10, whatever, we're going to see a bunch of curls, a bunch of routes that are either going to be easily jumped, broken up, whatever the situation is. There are high degree of difficulty throws for Jones as well. And they also contribute to him locking down on one receiver, seeing a flash of somebody making a first down, and then having the ball either tipped away, intercepted, whatever. I have a huge problem there. I also have a philosophical issue where Garrett seems to care more about taking time off the clock and setting up third and manageables rather than taking the risks to possibly make big plays. The only time he will take a shot usually is on first down. If that does not work, he will usually run the ball on 2nd and 10, which is one of my biggest pet peeves in football. I know that you will occasionally get a nice gain off of it, but what will normally happen is you will get a yard or two on a drop play, set up a 3rd and long that you're probably not going to convert, and then punt the ball away. the lack of aggressiveness just bothers me. The Giants' offense is not good enough to not take chances. Best case scenario, even with the weapons, they're 23rd in the league in scoring. You at least have to try to force the issue a little bit. And I do not see him being that guy. So just I hope he proves me wrong, but he's a guy who hasn't really been valuable in the NFL since he was the backup quarterback for the Giants 3 decades ago. And his mindset and his philosophy still remind me of that. Frankly, I just don't see it.
I think with Jason Garrett, I mean, I mentioned you talked about not being aggressive, and I agree on that second down stuff. It's horse shit when you run the football like that. But I question right here, how much of an impact do you think Saquon Barkley will have on this offense? I know he's a translucent talent. He can do a lot of great things. Do you think that will help out Jason Garrett's offense strictly based on what Barkley can bring?
A fully healthy Saquon Barkley can help to an extent if he is used in an intelligent way. Now, the one thing that he does have going for him is the Giants have a more power and gap blocking scheme that fits Saquon Barkley better, and he should be able to make the most out of some plays if he's healthy, which is a huge question mark. What I want to see, what I'm more curious to see is how Jason Garrett would use him as a receiver. That's a huge part of Saquon Barkley's appeal. And I want to see him on angle routes. I want him to get in space and have the opportunity to make people miss. If he's healthy, he's more than capable of doing that. And let's go back to Kadarius Toney for a second. I'm still not a huge fan of the pick, but I at least see the raw upside with him. He does absolutely have talent. My biggest problem is he will only succeed in the NFL with a creative offensive coordinator. Jason Garrett is not. He is definitively not a creative offensive coordinator. I want to see him use more motion in the offense, whether Tony's there or not. I want to see him make life more difficult for opposing defenses. I want safeties to be forced to choose between two guys so Jones can hit the other one. You pressure them, you have crossing traffic over the middle of the field. That's how you do it. He is not going to do that. He is going to run a 5-yard hitch or a curl or whatever and hope Sterling Shepard can make somebody miss. And nothing personal against him. It's just not an efficient offense. It's also an incredibly predictable and stale one that will be lucky to put up 17 points a game. We had the same problem last year. I know that the weapons are going to be better if they're healthy, huge if, but it's not going to matter with, I think, Jones's limitations, even more importantly, Jason Garrett's limitations, which we know aren't going to be fixed. And then the third issue, of course, is the offensive line.
Yeah, let's talk about the line real quick before we transition over to the Jets. But looking at this line, obviously, there's players coming back, one of them being Andrew Thomas, a highly invested pick. Shane Lemieux, I thought, played well last year. Nick Gates stepped up. Nick Gates was probably the most unpredicted start. He transitioned to a starting role now. He played pretty well last season. And then you got Will Hernandez, Matt Parrott, you got Nate Solder coming back. How do you see the line shaping up, and what do you think they'll bring?
I don't think they're going to bring much, honestly. I think they're going to be mostly be human turnstiles. I hope they prove me wrong here. I have not. Andrew Thomas obviously did not have a very good rookie season, but he was significantly better the second half of the year. So I was trying to be at least somewhat optimistic with him. But if that preseason game against the Patriots was any indication, we're fucked, because he, in 36 snaps, was responsible for 2.5 sacks, 4 pressures, and a holding penalty. I know that Josh Uche is a talented player and all, but that is a big problem in 36 snaps. It would be a whole big problem in a game. Now, he says all the right things. Attitude-wise, I can't compare him to Eric Flowers, but in terms of what we invested in him and what he looks like so far, it's hard not to at least be concerned. It's too early to call him a bust or anything. He's saying all the right things. I have no doubt that he's working at it, but if he does not at least provide serviceable left tackle play, the Giants don't have an alternative for him. I know Nate Solder used to be a pretty good NFL tackle, but he opted out last year and his skills were deteriorating before that regardless. A very regrettable free agent signing in my mind, and the only experienced player on the Giants offensive line. No other offensive lineman on the roster has been in the NFL for more than 4 years. Shane Lemieux is at least decent for a 5th-round pick in the run game, but he is horrible in pass protection. I think Nick Gates is a decent center. Will Hernandez hopefully can at least start to justify the 2nd-round pick that was invested in him. I think he will at least be a decent guard. We can at least talk about the depth moves the Giants have tried to make, because we talked about, of all their aggressiveness, they didn't draft a lineman or sign one in free agency. They did make trades for Billy Price from the Bengals and Ben Bredesen from the Ravens. And I do expect both of them to have roles on this offensive line before the end of the season.
Yeah, that's it's shaping up to be interesting with how the rotation will be. I mean, there were some injuries last year that led to some of the playing time. The depth, I don't think there's a lot of depth. I mean, there, you mentioned it in the Bears segment. There's not a lot of O-line depth in the league, and I don't think the Giants have a lot of that outside of Nate Solder, which, like you said, he's deteriorating. Last thing, I know I said that about the offensive line. Evan Ingram, the tight end position. Ingram has an injury right now. Do you expect him ready for Week 1?
Honestly, I'm not sure. The calf injuries are always difficult.
Yeah.
Evan Ingram frustrates me more than any other player on the Giants roster, and we haven't even mentioned him yet until now. So it's just, there's a lot of concerns I have. Kyle Rudolph, I'm hoping will be ready for Week 1, but he's a question mark as well. The only fully healthy tight end on the roster right now is Caden Smith. So I would expect the Giants to claim someone to fortify the tight end position just in case. I hope Ingram proves me wrong. Look, I don't think he'll be ready for Week 1. I think there's a better chance Rudolph will be, because he's been practicing. And Rudolph is kind of the opposite of Evan Ingram. He's not a great athlete, but he's reliable and can catch the ball. That will be a refreshing change of pace, because whatever patience I had for Ingram ran out last season. He's making the same mistakes he did in his rookie year in year 4, now going into year 5. How many passes does he have to drop before the rest of the Giants fan base turns on him too?
Right. He hasn't had a good tenure with his time there, but as we wrap up the Giants, I'm curious what you think record-wise here this season.
All right. Well, listen up right here. There are a lot of people who looked at the Giants' moves. They looked at the skill position players. They look at the pretty good defense and think the Giants could win a admittedly flawed division. I don't think there's a chance in hell of that happening. I obviously hope the Giants prove me wrong, but I think their best case is winning 9 or 10 games. Well, that might be enough to win this shitty division. Is that really the best thing long-term? Because I think that might lead to investing in Daniel Jones long-term as well, or Jason Garrett, which would be even worse. So, okay. I think the Giants are basically a worse version of Washington, especially on the offensive line. We might have better playmakers if they're healthy. Defenses are comparable. Dallas's offense blows us out of the water, of course, but their defense is complete shit. The Eagles are going through a rebuild, but I think Jalen Hurts is going to be better than people expect, so I wouldn't write them out completely. I think the Giants' chances of winning this division or making the playoffs are about as real as Bishop Sycamore's football team. I'm expecting 5-12.
Yeah, I'm sitting. I know I went 6-11 on the Bears. I think 5-12 is honestly realistic. It's somewhere around that area. Right now, I'm going to tease a little bit this week. I got Dallas, I got Washington, and I got the last 2-3 games deciding who finishes in 4th place in this division between the Giants and the Eagles. I personally think the Eagles are set up for disaster, and they're probably going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL this season. So with that, I'm going to give the Giants a record. I'm actually going back to 6-11 here for the Giants.
It's not impossible. And I can at least understand where people are coming from, where they might win 8 to 10 games. I think that is their ceiling. The defense is legitimately good, I think, especially if it stays healthy. If the Giants' skill position players are healthy, there's a lot there, but I don't trust any of them to be used correctly by our dipshit offensive coordinator. But Saquon Barkley, I get it. Great running back if he's healthy. Big if, of course, coming off the torn ACL and everything. Galladay, Darius Slayton, Shepard, hopefully Kadarius Toney, whatever we can get out of John Ross. Whatever we can get out of John Ross, almost knocked my microphone over there. There are a lot of different talents there. They can all bring something different to the wide receiver room. And then Evan Ingram, Kyle Rudolph, Caden Smith, similar. They all have very different skill sets from the tight end spot. skill positions there, but I don't think the issues at quarterback or on the offensive line or with the play calling can really be overcome, at least not fully. So the Giants' ceiling is a mediocre team, and their floor is about as low as the 2017 season was, where they finished 3-13. I don't see the upside, despite the fact that the Giants' roster is relatively well-rounded outside of quarterback and offensive line, but those are pretty important positions.
I like that Bishop Sycamore joke. That's pretty funny. But let's get into the Jets. Odd transition here, but let's get into the Jets. Let's look at them for a little bit. And obviously, this team has a lot of promise. I know they're coming off a pretty shitty year last year, but hey, there's some promise surrounding the New York Jets. That's all right. We beat down the Giants pretty hard. The Bears we beat down for their decision making. Jets are rolling out Zach Wilson. They have a new head coach in Robert Saleh. They have a lot of good things going in their direction. Mike LaFleur is their offensive coordinator. And I think this is going to be a developmental year for sure. I don't think they're going to win any big games or anything, but I think it's going to be a solid developmental year for the Jets.
There's definitely some things to be hopeful for on both sides of the ball, but this Jets team is also incredibly flawed still. Well, most optimistic fans, I am obviously not one of those people. If you listen to the last 15 minutes of talk that we just had, but if you look at everything through rose-colored glasses, the Jets have an exciting new coach that's not Adam Gase. That's a step in the right direction. They have an exciting new scheme on both sides of the ball. They have the 3-4 defense back. They have, of course, a rookie quarterback in Zach Wilson, who was drafted second overall. They made some pretty important free agent splashes. They brought in Elijah Vera Tucker on the offensive line. But we cannot ignore just how rough the Jets are. The Giants' strength is in the secondary. That is going to be the Jets' weak spot. That is one position they didn't really address in the offseason, and I do not think that they are going to be a good pass coverage team on the defensive side of the ball. You want to start offense or defense here?
Yeah, let's start defense. We started defense with every team. Let's start defense with this team. And you brought up their secondary. Bryce Hall is their only cornerback. Simply put, Bless Austin was cut, if I'm not mistaken. Bless Austin was cut. He's number one on their depth chart on ourlads.com right now, which is the go-to site for depth charts, I believe. Not a sponsor, but we'll give him a nice shout out here. LaMarcus Joyner, Marcus May are the two on the defensive side in the secondary that are nice. But outside of that, the cornerback position isn't good. I forgot the nickelback position with Javelin or Guidry there. Sorry. Looking at that, it's sort of a weird spot for them. But they did make this, or they traded with the Shaq Lawson. That was very interesting. What did you think?
Well, they traded for that because Carl Lawson, the huge pass rusher that was signed, unfortunately got hurt and is going to miss the entire season. So the Jets absolutely had to make a move there. And I do like that pickup. They only gave up a 6th-round pick. Shaq Lawson is a solid, not spectacular, but a solid NFL pass rusher who can at least pressure the quarterback to a limited extent. But Carl Lawson was signed because the Jets envisioned him filling that incredibly important role in the Saleh defense from the defensive end spot. And Shaq Lawson is just not going to be able to replace everything that he was expected to bring to the table. He will be serviceable, but that's not going to frankly be enough. The Jets pass rush outside of that, at least at the defensive end spot, is a little bit rough. Where I do think that they are going to be solid defensively is right up the middle, because I do like the idea of Quinnen Williams and Sheldon Rankins collapsing pockets from the interior. I think that could be a very effective 1-2 combination.
Yeah, they're solid up front. That's where you look. It's Quinnen Williams. He's that dude. I mean, he's that dude. He's someone who builds. I don't want to say build your franchise around, because he's a defensive player and it's not necessarily a flashy quarterback, which is usually that's what people look at when you look at a football team. But Quinnen Williams is a nice piece defensively, and we mentioned him being the shiny piece of trash that was the Jets last season. And he's a nice spot. He's in a good spot for them. He gets a good defensive coordinator who's now the head coach. That's going to help him out a ton. You get a smart football mind in there that isn't Greg Williams, who, granted, he's had his ups and downs in the NFL, a lot of downs, a lot of down moments, but he's still a decent defensive mind. I think Robert Saleh helps him out immensely, and the linebacking position is something I want to look at with C.J. Mosley, Gerard Davis, and then they drafted, I believe, 2 or 3 linebackers, so that could be huge.
They also drafted two different Michael Carters, which I thought
in
was kind of
back-to-back
funny.
rounds.
Yeah, and one of them plays defense, and the linebacker spot. Like I do think C.J. Mosley is a big X factor just because he opted out last season. We know how good he can be. Can we expect him to be full strength? Like, I'm not saying he can't, but he is just a complete wild card. I think Gerard Davis is a solid player next to him. I don't expect him to be anything too special, but I think he could fill a solid role in the defense. But even with Marcus May, who, they were not able to come to the long-term contract agreement with, and LaMarcus Joyner, who's at least a decent veteran 1-year option here, that secondary, especially at corner, is just awful. I think it's the worst group of cornerbacks in the NFL right now. I mean, where we could see the other Lamar Jackson starting again. We've seen just, Bryce Hall, fine, I guess, but he should be a CB 3 or 4. He can make a roster. He should not be who you're expecting to be shutting down the other team's top wide receiver because, frankly, he can't do that, at least not yet. And I think the injury to Carl Lawson is also going to force the Jets to scheme more pressure in terms of blitzing. They're going to have to blitz more from either the secondary or the linebacker spot. And they were going to really rely on that front four to generate the pressure, right? To try to take the strain off of their secondary. The Giants can, for example, can go the other way around. They have a strong secondary, so they go for the pass coverage approach. But the Jets do not have that luxury. If they do not generate pressure from their front four, their back end is not good enough to prevent chunk plays.
Yeah, they're going to be cooked. They're going to be absolutely cooked. Do you have any other comments on the Jets defense you want to look at before we get into the offense?
No, I think let's talk about what everyone's here for. We got to get into the offensive talk, and especially Zach Wilson right at the beginning.
Right, Zach Wilson, obviously a pick right there. With he's went number 2 in the draft. Is one of the best quarterbacks in the draft class, at least coming out. I think he's solid. I think he's solid where he is right now. So he's a young quarterback. They don't have a lot of experience behind him, which could be an issue. I think Zach Wilson is nice. He's gonna have a big role this season, and I think that's where I sit.
Okay. See, I'm not quite as big on Zach Wilson as I was on Justin Fields, but I absolutely see the talent with him. We know that he kind of blew up with the big off-platform throws. He is fantastic off-script ability. I think that's where you see the biggest upside right there. Like, not saying that Lawrence or Justin Fields don't have the ability to move around and make things happen, but I think Zach Wilson has the most natural feel for making things happen when the play breaks down a little bit. And we're going to see some exciting flashes. We already have in the preseason. We have in camp as well. I do think that the Jets have a decent group of weapons as well. It's a little bit underrated, especially at the wide receiver spot. I really, really liked the Elijah Moore pick. If we were going to take a receiver in the first round in the 20s, I would have preferred him to Kadarius Toney for whatever that's worth for you. And he's been one of the stars of Jets camp. I think Corey Davis, who they brought in as a free agent, is a solid, not spectacular, but a very solid NFL player who should be a good, reliable target for Wilson. And then we can't forget the Denzel Mims, the second round pick who flashed in brief moments last year, and Jamison Crowder, who's kind of the Sterling Shepard of the Jets, a bit of a security blanket who can do a little bit of everything. Those are 4 at least serviceable wide receivers at the very least. The running back room, I'm not quite as big on. I do think the Michael Carter running back will become better as the season goes along. I like Michael P. Ryan in the goal line package. But what do you think of the Jets skill position players?
I love their wide receivers. I do. I think you look at Keelan Cole. That's another name you didn't mention. He's had a lot of big receptions on the Jaguars team a few years ago. He's a solid wide receiver. I think it is. He could bring a lot to your room. He wasn't necessarily a big name, but he could still step in there. He's a veteran guy. He can make plays. So he's solid. I think the running back room is going to need some work. I don't understand why Ty Johnson still has a job in the NFL, but he's sticking around. I like the Michael Carter pick. I think he can boom, not necessarily in a big role, but I think he can if he gets the carries. So he's a good spot. I think the additions on the outside are solid, but they did also trade Chris Herndon, who's sort of been a bust in the Jets' tenure. What do you think?
Yeah, I wanted to get into the Herndon thing in a second. Now, don't forget also the Tevin Coleman, that he is still on the Jets roster as well, a bit of a veteran in that room. The
Right.
Jets, one of the weak spots skill position wise right now is definitely the tight end spot. I don't really have a problem with them cutting bait on Herndon, send him to Minnesota, who needed a tight end after Irv Smith got hurt, and they got a couple of picks for him. I really don't have a problem with that, but he was the one guy on the Jets tight end room that you could at least look at and say, okay, there might be some untapped potential here. Obviously, a lot of drop passes and flaws as well, but there might be something you can milk out of him with the right coordinator. Right now, the Jets' only NFL caliber tight end is Tyler Croft, and I'm not expecting too much out of him. No offense. I don't see too much of a role for him as a receiver, but we'll see if he proves me wrong. He should be at least more reliable than Herndon, but he's definitely not going to be as flashy or talented as a receiver either. We got to talk about the offensive line, though. While I do think Mekhi Becton and Elijah Vera Tucker both are going to be very, very good NFL players, Becton definitely had some pretty good moments his rookie year already. I still think pass protection is going to be a major issue for the Jets, especially the rest of that offensive line. And that is going to cause some problems for Zach Wilson. And it's also going to cause him to rush some reads, rush some throws, and it might keep him from being able to get the ball to some of his more talented weapons.
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, outside of those two, of Mekhi Becton, he really stepped up on and the offensive line last year. But the center and the right guard, yuck. I mean, Connor McGovern, Greg Van Ruten, that's not going to win you a lot of football games.
Yeah, so basically, I think we're in agreement that the Jets have two legitimate pieces on the offensive line right now, which is better than nothing, but there are also three gigantic question marks, especially on the right side of the line. So I do have some low expectations there. I think that will limit the Jets' ground game as well, which it doesn't have the most talented running back room in the world either. I do like the Jets' wide receivers a decent amount, but I think the Jets will only be able to do so much offensively. Wilson will only be able to do so much offensively. And I did want to mention briefly, at least, the Jets' backup quarterback situation, because if something were to happen to Wilson, right now their backup is Mike White, who I believe was a fifth-round pick out of Western Kentucky, if memory serves me right, a couple years ago. I know he spent some time with Dallas. I don't think he's been in an NFL game yet, and I don't think that's a promising situation if anything were to happen to Wilson. So I could see it being like a few years ago when they had Geno Smith, they brought in Michael Vick as a backup. I could see the Jets making a similar move, just somebody with a veteran as a veteran. They had Joe Flacco last year, for example. I'm sure they'd look for someone at least better than him. But right now, the only other options, if something were to happen to the prized rookie, Mike White and possibly James Morgan. So that is pretty uninspiring.
Do you think that's a Nick Foles destination?
I don't think it's impossible. I do think that if a team has a quarterback injury that hasn't happened yet, they're going to call the Bears about Foles because they know damn well he's available. And if they have enough room to fit him on the salary cap, he could at least be a serviceable backup. So that would not be the worst idea. I'm curious to see if Cam Newton latches on anywhere. There are a couple of options, but right now the Jets have, I'd say, either the worst or the weirdest backup quarterback situation in the NFL. And if the Jets offensive line gets Wilson killed, a la Joe Burrow, that could become an issue.
Wasn't it the Jets that started? They started some weird quarterbacks last year. If memory serves me right, they started someone against the Patriots on a Thursday night that no one ever heard of.
Luke Falk.
Luke Falk. Yeah, they started Luke freaking Falk. I mean,
I've heard of him.
Yeah, of course, because he watched him on Thursday night. But
I watched him at Washington State, the same school Gardner Minshew went to.
Okay, good call on your part there. But I mean, it's ridiculous
here.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that you can't bring in a veteran quarterback, at least sort of pave the way. I know he's not. You're putting Zach Wilson back there with someone who's been in the league for a year or two, and that's it. You don't have any veteran experience back there. I know Alex Smith is retired, but I thought that would have been a good spot for him to sort of mentor and be a backup. But I mean, that's you need to get a veteran back there at some point.
I think it would be more just as insurance because I do think Zach Wilson is going to learn more from the game reps, obviously, or the practice reps than anything else. But I do think that the offensive line issues, the running game issues are going to limit him. And the Jets are the only offense in the league that scored less points a game than the Giants last year. The other way to say that, they finished dead last in the league in scoring. So they're obviously going to need to take a jump to have any opportunity to improve past more than a handful of wins this season. I do think they are slowly heading in the right direction. I understand why Joe Douglas did not go out and overpay for a corner. On the defensive side, you could argue the Giants did with Adoree Jackson or William Jackson with the Bengals, for example. It wasn't a super great corner class. And the Jets' other options can be fixed in due time in terms of addressing the line more, addressing running back more. I think they're already in decent shape wide receiver wise. They're going to need some help at tight end. There's some pieces on the defense, but considering the other three teams in this division are all built to win right now to varying degrees, you want to make our predictions?
Yeah, let's do it. The
Okay.
Jets, God damn, dude. The teams that we root for, or not necessarily root for, the teams we cover here on the show, brutal, man. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. But, I could literally say 6-11 for every freaking team. But I think the Jets are in a situation, a young offense. There is some talent there. Their defense is going to give up some big plays. I personally believe in the Patriots this year, Mac Jones or not. We'll get into that next week. I think this Jets team, which is still an improvement, will win 4 football games this year and go 4-13.
All right. Well, I was actually going to have the same prediction on that one. I do think they are better. And I do think they are going to manage to steal a couple of games, but their limitations in their tough division, they haven't been able to beat anyone in their division consistently in God knows how long. So and considering the Bills should be a contender for for possibly the Super Bowl, at the very least, another AFC championship game, there's at least some hope around the Dolphins, which is pretty well-rounded, just depending on how Tua does. And then the Patriots, who are uber aggressive in free agency, shored up a lot of their holes, have a good front seven that's going to make the Jets offensive line their life hell in the 2 meetings this year. If the Jets are going to win a few games, I think they're going to have to win them outside of the 6 division games.
Yep, that's where my head's at too. Speaking of division games and all the divisions, we'll get into it next week here on the Big City Sports Podcast. Dive in NFC, AFC, East, North, South, West, whatever it is. We'll get into all of it, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So I appreciate everyone that tuned in today. Be sure to check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. I know I'm missing one. Apple, Spotify. No, that's it. All podcasting platforms. It's all sponsored by Anchor. Subscribe to get your podcasts on there. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for today. For Swig, for Dylan, we will see you next time.